decades, the CIA has operated in the shadows, manipulating governments, orchestrating coups, and as it turns out, using religion as one of its most powerful tools. But what if I told you that one of America's most famous pastors may have unknowingly played a role in US intelligence operations? This is the untold story of how faith and espionage became unlikely allies, and how the most important Christian figure of the 20th century found himself in the middle of a global intelligence war. Billy Graham was born in 1918 in Charlotte, North Carolina, and grew up on a dairy farm during the Great Depression. Raised in a devout Christian household, his faith was deeply rooted in fundamentalist Baptist teachings. But it wasn't until a revival meeting at age 16 that he experienced a personal transformation. After attending Bob Jones College and later transferring to Florida Bible Institute, he became convinced that preaching the gospel was his life's calling. It was there, on the banks of the Hillsborough River, that he made the commitment to fully devote his life to spreading the word of Christ.
And some the gift of an evangelist, and I believe that God gave me the gift of an evangelist.
Graham's charisma and unwavering conviction set him apart. He quickly rose to prominence in the Youth for Christ movement, traveling across the US and Europe in the 1940s to preach to soldiers returning from World War II. His message was simple but powerful. Jesus is the answer to the world's problems. His big break came in 1941 when he held a tent revival in Los Angeles. Originally scheduled for 3 weeks, the crusade lasted 8 weeks, drawing national attention.
Can be received, your sins forgiven, your burdens lifted, your problems solved by turning your life over to Him, repenting of your sin, and turning to Jesus Christ as Savior.
Even major figures in Hollywood and politics took notice. The press, including William Randolph Hearst, instructed his newspapers to puff Graham, launching him into the national spotlight. By the late 1950s, Billy Graham had become America's pastor, leading mass crusades that filled stadiums worldwide. His sermons were broadcast to millions through radio and television, making him one of the first evangelists to fully harness the power of modern media. His unshakable faith and moral integrity were key to his influence. Unlike many preachers who fell into scandal, Graham avoided corruption by implementing strict ethical guidelines, including financial transparency and his famous Billy Graham rule, which ensured he would never be alone with a woman who was not his wife. His commitment to biblical teachings was evident in his messages. He often quoted John 14:6, saying, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." His crusades emphasized salvation, redemption, and the urgency of accepting Christ. By the 60s, Billy Graham had preached to over 100 million people in person, and even more through television and radio. He became an advisor to world leaders, meeting with presidents, kings, and even Queen Elizabeth II, who admired his message of faith. But while Billy Graham was focused on saving souls, his unprecedented access to global leaders and his alignment with anti-communist ideals made him an attractive figure. Graham often cited Proverbs 4:25-27, saying, "Let your eyes look directly forward and your gaze be straight before you. Turn away from evil." He lived by this, ensuring his ministry remained untarnished. His ability to move people was undeniable. He spoke with conviction, his sermons punctuated by powerful calls to faith, leaving thousands in tears as they came forward to accept Christ. His message was simple, yet transformative. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever.
What never changes? The nature of God doesn't change. God hasn't changed. He hasn't changed to adapt himself to our generation.
But beyond his spiritual mission, Graham was deeply intertwined with the highest levels of government, meeting with every US president from Harry Truman to George W. Bush. This access put him in a unique position, one that intelligence agencies found very useful. Billy's ability to connect with world leaders made him one of the most politically connected religious figures in modern history. His relationship with US presidents spanned over 6 decades, and each administration saw him in a unique light. Some as a friend, others as a trusted advisor, and some perhaps a convenient political tool. Harry Truman, from 1945 to 1953, became Graham's first meeting with a US president, and did not go as planned. When he visited President Truman in 1950, he later spoke about the meeting to reporters, some that deeply irritated Truman, who disliked public displays of faith. The relationship never fully recovered, but this moment taught Graham a crucial lesson. Faith and politics required discretion, and it was unfortunate that this led to him and Truman not ending on the greatest terms. Then came Dwight D. Eisenhower. During Eisenhower's presidency, Graham became a trusted spiritual advisor. Eisenhower saw religion as a crucial weapon against atheistic communism. He frequently sought Graham's advice, particularly on matters of morality and leadership. Graham embodied Jesus' teaching from Matthew 7:3-5, which warns against judging others. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? He chose to see the good in people, offering spiritual guidance rather than condemnation. And then, of course, there were the Bushes, George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. Both Bush presidents considered Graham a spiritual mentor. George W. Bush in particular credited Graham with helping him overcome alcoholism and strengthening his faith, while played a crucial role in his presidential campaigns to appeal to evangelical voters. Through 6 decades, Billy Graham was more than just a preacher. He was an insider in the highest levels of power. Some saw him as a man of godly integrity, while others viewed him as a tool for political influence. These declassified CIA documents that have been released in the last decade suggest that these ties to the US leaders were not just spiritual primarily, but they were also strategic. But for whom? So let's get into this. To my surprise, I was curious. I wanted to research more of Billy Graham, a figure that I admire. But more importantly, one of the things that I am also fascinated by is the world of espionage. So I decided to type in the search engine, Billy Graham, CIA. And of course, none other than pulled up was the CIA.gov. 2 files, one of them saying Mr. Graham's Adventures and Graham Denies Knowledge. I read through these declassified documents, and to say I was surprised would be an understatement. What I came to find out was the mass CIA ploy to utilize Christian evangelist Billy Graham, to utilize their goal of Western influence, and if none other than intelligence dominance across the world. Throughout the Cold War, the United States saw communism as an existential crisis, not just politically, but spiritually. To combat the godless ideology of the Soviet Union, the CIA turned to an unlikely weapon. The church, missionaries, televangelists, and even the Vatican played roles in intelligence gathering, psychological warfare, and ideological propaganda. The Summer Institute of Linguistics, SIL, and Wycliffe Bible translators, both missionary groups, were suspected of conducting linguistic research while also collecting intelligence on remote indigenous populations in Latin America. World Vision, a well-known Christian humanitarian organization, was deeply embedded in CIA operations in Vietnam, El Salvador, and even Afghanistan. Some of its programs were fronts for intelligence gatherings. And then there was the Missionary Aviation Fellowship, MAF, a group that flew missionary planes into hard-to-reach regions. Some of these flights were reportedly carrying CIA operatives and supplies for rebel groups supported by the US government. Beyond missionaries, the CIA's reach extended to Catholic institutions. The American Friends of the Middle East, AFME, an organization originally founded to foster cross-cultural exchange, was later revealed to be a CIA front group used to counter Arab national movements. The Vatican itself was not immune to CIA influence. Pope John Paul II's efforts to combat communism in Poland were reportedly backed by US intelligence agencies, further proving the CIA's ability to embed itself within religious institutions. The declassified document also reveals that in Chile, church organizations were covertly funded by the CIA to undermine Salvador Allende's socialist government, ensuring religious institutions played a role in political destabilization. But perhaps the most surprising connection of all was the CIA's relationship with Billy Graham. It's important to point out that Billy Graham wasn't just a preacher, he was America's pastor, a man whose sermons reached millions worldwide, but his influence extended far beyond the pulpit. From the 1950s to the 1960s, Billy Graham was a staunch anti-communist, often framing the Cold War as a spiritual battle between Christian freedom and atheist oppression. This rhetoric closely mirrored CIA-backed narratives, Billy Graham's support for anti-communism wasn't just rhetorical. His association with the CIA and the US government was much more profound than mere ideological alignment. The declassified CIA documents show that the agency had a vested interest in using Billy Graham's global influence to promote American values and combat communist ideology worldwide. In the documents, one of the most groundbreaking discoveries was his 1977 Soviet Union trip. In 1977, Billy Graham made a historic trip to the Soviet Union, becoming the first evangelical Christian preacher to visit the country since the Bolshevik Revolution. The Cold War was at its peak, and tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were running high. But Graham's mission was not to confront the USSR. It was, on the surface, to preach to the Soviet people and share the gospel of Christ. While the Soviet Union was officially an atheistic state, there was still a small underground network of Christian believers, particularly in the Russian Orthodox Church and various Protestant sects. Graham's trip was seen as a gesture of peace, and it was framed as an effort to engage the Soviet people in a positive way. However, what many didn't know was that the CIA was closely monitoring Graham's trip. The declassified documents suggest that US intelligence agencies saw this as an opportunity to infiltrate Soviet society under the guise of religion, using Graham as an unwitting diplomatic tool. According to insiders, Graham was briefed before his trip by US officials about the political landscape and the CIA interests within the USSR. His message was focused just on faith, but it also made sure to echo anti-communistic rhetoric, reinforcing the narrative that religious freedom could thrive under a capitalist, free society as opposed to the Soviet model. The trip to the Soviet Union raised eyebrows in both Washington, D.C. and in Moscow. On the one hand, the Soviet leadership saw Graham as an opportunity to promote their own version of religious tolerance, but on the other, his presence was a thorn in the side, a regime that had long been at odds with religion. Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet leader at the time, allowed Graham's visit, but sources suggest it was done in the hope that Graham's message of peace would soften Western criticism of Soviet policies and present a positive image of the USSR to the world. What Graham didn't know was that his every move was under surveillance by the KGB, who kept a watchful eye on the meetings he had with Soviet religious leaders. Among the key figures he met were Archbishop Petrum of the Russian Orthodox Church, a modern figure who wanted to see some level of religious freedom restored in the Soviet Union, and evangelist Peter Lukhensky, a prominent evangelical leader in Russia at the time. Despite the warm reception, there were clear signs that Graham's real purpose to counter communist propaganda wasn't entirely welcomed by the Soviets. In private, KGB officers reported that Graham's message had resonated with many Soviet citizens, and his insistence on religious freedom directly challenged the Soviets' atheist dogma. One of the key moments of the trip came when Graham publicly praised the Soviet Union's efforts to allow religious practice, a statement that appeared to support the narrative that the US and the USSR could exist in a Christian framework. This stance aligned directly with the CIA's broader goals of ideological warfare, using figures like Graham to push back against the spread of communism through a religious lens. Many insiders, however, believe the trip was more than just a Christian mission. There are reports suggesting that Graham was unknowingly used as a propaganda tool, providing the CIA with a valuable narrative weapon against Soviet influence. The agency would have seen this as a unique opportunity to publicly promote religious freedom in a tightly controlled communist state. As I investigated further into the documents, another key moment came up, and that was Billy Graham's 1973 crusade in South Korea, perhaps his most significant ever, where his message deemed to echo the political agenda of the US-backed dictatorship in the region. So in 1973, Graham's crusade drew over 1 million people in Seoul, South Korea, making it one of the largest gatherings in country's history. But the timing of the event was deeply significant. South Korea was under the rule of General Park Chung-hee, a military dictator who had come to power in a 1961 coup and had since solidified his control with the help of US support. In declassified CIA documents, it is revealed that Park's government was a key US ally in East Asia during the Cold War. The US had poured significant resources into supporting Park's regime as part of the broader strategy to contain communist influence in the region. The South Korean government used Graham's crusade to bolster its image as a stable, modernizing nation aligned with Western values, a message that would resonate both domestically and within the US government. Though Graham's messages were framed in religious terms, they inadvertently aligned with the anti-communist rhetoric of Park's regime. His speeches promoting Christianity as a force for good against communist tyranny reaffirmed the US and South Korea's shared ideological struggle. His message to the masses: we must all stand together against the forces of communism, and backing Park's regime. Many of the attendees at Graham's crusade were likely military personnel, government officials, and citizens who were sympathetic to the regime's anti-communist stance. Some even believed the South Korean government played a role in mobilizing the crowds to attend the event, ensuring the message was delivered not just to the faithful, but to the general population. In the documents, it is noted that Billy Graham's crusade served as a propaganda tool for the South Korean government, reinforcing the image of a regime that stood in solidarity with Christian values, while also fighting the communist threat. This, of course, aligned perfectly with US interests in the region, ensuring that Graham's trip was not just a religious event, but a highly political one. Once again, there is no evidence that Billy Graham consciously worked with the CIA hand in hand, handing over reports, working as an asset, or even in the South Korean government to further these political goals. But the convergence of interests, religion, geopolitics, and anti-communist sentiment meant that his crusades became instrumental in furthering US geopolitical objectives. Billy Graham's legacy is cemented as the most important Christian figure of the 20th century, a man who brought millions to Christ, while also having agencies like the CIA seeing his influence overlapping with the world of geopolitics. The story of religion and espionage is far from over. Even today, faith-based organizations continue to receive US government funding, and the intelligence community still uses ideological warfare to shape public opinion. So did Billy Graham knowingly work with the CIA, or was he just a convenient messenger for the agenda? Or was he even using the CIA to infiltrate these countries for his own goal of ultimately spreading the word of Christ? Let us know in the comments. If you want more deep dives into hidden truths, subscribe to the Alessi channel. Turn on notifications because we are just getting started.